In remote Australia, a family's weekly grocery basket costs 26% more than the same items in Sydney. Not because the food is different or the store is fancier, but because in hundreds of towns across this country, there is one supermarket and no alternative for 70 kilometres in any direction. Now, let's look at the bigger picture. Two companies, Woolworths and Coles, control roughly two-thirds of every grocery dollar spent in Australia. They hold interests in more than 150 undeveloped retail sites between them. To put that into perspective, their closest competitor, Aldi, has only managed to secure 13 sites after more than 20 years in the country. This imbalance of power has real consequences. When the ACCC investigated, suppliers admitted they were often paid less than their actual production costs and they had no power to negotiate. Farmers face the exact same reality. They operate in an industry where a single phone call from a corporate head office can instantly cut them off from most of the national market. This is the most familiar place in Australian life, the supermarket aisle, and it perfectly highlights a deep structural divide, one that no election has ever addressed. In 1924, Woolworths opened on Pitt Street in Sydney as a small variety store. It sold everyday items like sweets, stockings, and household goods. Nothing suggested it would eventually control more than a third of every grocery dollar spent in the country. Coles, operating in Melbourne since 1914, sold similar general merchandise. For decades, neither company sold food. It wasn't until the 1950s that both chains made the same calculated pivot. They realised that the future wasn't in socks and saucepans, it was in groceries. This shift sparked one of the longest, quietest corporate land grabs in Australian history. Slowly, names that used to line every suburban high street started disappearing. Action, Bilo, Rainbow, Tuckerbag, Jewel, Flemings, and Newmart were swallowed up, one by one. A struggling competitor got bought out, or a regional brand was absorbed into a bigger operation. And with every quiet buyout, Australians lost a little more choice. Even with all those acquisitions, Coles and Woolworths still only controlled about 40% of the grocery market by the 1980s. Independents and specialist grocers filled the gaps. Shoppers still had real options. But here's the twist. The thing that permanently locked this duopoly into place wasn't another wave of buyouts. It was something far less visible. It was infrastructure. Through the 90s and 2000s, both companies invested billions into logistics networks, automated distribution centers, and integrated supply chains that no smaller competitor could afford to replicate. At the same time, they secured long-term leases on prime retail, becoming the essential anchor tenants inside suburban shopping centers. Today, 80% of Coles leased stores have more than 10 years remaining on their agreements, and Woolworths is in a similar position. These aren't just shops anymore. They are territorial claims, deeply embedded into the architecture of Australian cities and towns. Meanwhile, the regulatory system designed to prevent this kind of concentration completely missed it. Australian competition law is designed to look at individual mergers, assessing them one transaction at a time. It was simply never built to catch a massive pattern unfolding across 50 years, suburb by suburb, lease by lease. Sure, the ACCC eventually blocked some attempts by the Big Two to buy up IGA stores, but by then the damage was done. By the 2000s, their combined market share crossed 50%. By the mid-2020s, it hit roughly 65%, and somehow the country barely even noticed. To understand how we got here, we need to look closely at the true cost of a dollar. On Australia Day 2011, Coles dropped the price of their home brand milk to just $1 a litre. It was framed as a gift to working families. Within days, Woolworths matched the price. Aldi soon followed. For nearly a decade, the price barely moved. A litre of milk was suddenly cheaper than a litre of bottled water. But somebody paid for that dollar. Supermarkets treated milk as a loss leader, selling it at or below cost just to pull customers through the doors to buy other items. Eventually, the financial hit was passed down to those with the least power, the farmers. In the years that followed, dairy farm numbers collapsed. Production hit a 30-year low by 2024. A country that once exported dairy in significant volumes became a net importer of butter in 2017, and now produces barely 60% of what it consumes. Under intense public pressure, the supermarkets abandoned the dollar milk model in 2019. But by then, an entire generation of farming families had already walked away. The ACCC later noted that the squeeze also ran through processors and global markets, but the symbolic damage was done, and the industry's decline accelerated. While the milk wars made headlines, a silent squeeze across the rest of the supply chain has been equally destructive. During a 2024 inquiry, the ACCC heard from hundreds of fruit growers, vegetable producers, and meat processors. They all described a broken system where the two major buyers dictated terms. Perishable food suppliers reported being forced into weekly tenders with zero transparency and no ability to negotiate. The regulator called the power imbalance concerning. The suppliers used a simpler word: survival. Beyond the suppliers, there's a quiet battle for shelf space happening right in the aisles. Both supermarkets have been steadily expanding their private label ranges. These are the house brands that sit right next to products made by independent Australian manufacturers. Today, Coles makes roughly 35% of its grocery revenue from its private labels, while Woolworths sits at about 30%. When these big supermarkets expand their own brands, branded products from smaller suppliers get delisted just to free up shelf space. The supermarket stops being just a retailer and becomes a direct competitor to its own suppliers. Now here's another twist, and it's geographic. In Sydney or Melbourne, the supermarket duopoly is mostly an inconvenience. You might pay a little more than you should, but you have Aldi down the road, maybe a Harris Farm or a local greengrocer. You have options. But in regional and remote Australia, the supermarket isn't one option among several. It is the food system. The Northern Territory government found that the average basket of groceries in remote stores costs 26% more than in major cities. Nearly 1 in 3 Australians living in remote areas experiences food insecurity. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities face compounding issues: fewer stores, higher freight costs, longer distances, and less fresh food on the shelves. Freight costs are real, no one disputes that. But the question is why no competitor has found a way to serve these communities when the infrastructure exists to ship goods across an entire continent for major retailers. A simple global comparison shows just how unusual this situation really is. In Germany, 5 major chains, Aldi, Lidl, Edeka, Rewe, and the Schwarz Group, compete nationwide, and no single retailer controls more than a quarter of the market. In the UK, the market is split 6 ways. Even in small, regional British towns, shoppers usually have 3 or 4 competing supermarkets within a short drive. In Australia, entire communities depend on a single store. And that store answers to a distant head office in Sydney or Melbourne, which sets prices based on national profit margins rather than local needs. Ultimately, this creates a profound divide. It's the gap between Australians who live inside a competitive market and Australians who live at the mercy of one that has no reason to compete at all. In early 2026, the federal court case against Coles began in Melbourne. The ACCC alleged that hundreds of products promoted under the chain's Down Down campaign were not genuine discounts at all. They claimed that Coles had temporarily raised prices by at least 15% on hundreds of everyday items and then dropped them back to the original price or higher and labelled them as savings. The ACCC called the discounts utterly misleading and illusory. A former chair of the commission called it the case of the century. Woolworths faces a separate trial on similar allegations involving its prices drops promotions. The maximum penalty is $50 million per contravention. A consumer class action has also been filed, with estimates suggesting affected households could claim hundreds of thousands of dollars each, depending on their spending. In response to all this, the government has committed $30 million to enforce the rules. They also plan to overhaul zoning laws to let competitors enter the market, and the ACCC has recommended 20 reforms, from requiring shrinkflation disclosures to funding community-owned stores in remote areas. But reforming a market this deeply entrenched is incredibly slow. The property leases are locked in for decades. The supply chains are tightly controlled. You simply can't rebuild nationwide distribution networks overnight. And for the towns that desperately need competition, the places where a single store dictates the price of milk, bread, and veggies, the wait for a second option could take years. In practice, this means a single mother in remote Tennant Creek spends over a quarter of her income on groceries that would cost significantly less in Adelaide. It means a dairy farmer in northern Queensland works 7 days a week and earns less per hour than the teenager stacking shelves at the store that sells his milk. These aren't extreme edge cases. For Australians living outside the competitive zones, this is just everyday life. Meanwhile, the rest of the country walks into one of two nearly identical stores every single week. The trolley rolls forward, the yellow tags promise savings. Every week, millions of Australians pass through these aisles. Yet, we are participating in a system that was never voted on, never debated in an election, and never fully explained by any headline. Think about that family in remote Australia, the one paying 26% more for the exact same basket of groceries. They live in the same country as the rest of us. They buy the same brands, from the same supply chains, under the exact same store logos. The only difference is their postcode. In their town, the market simply decided that competition wasn't worth the effort, and no one ever asked them if that was acceptable. The supermarket wars didn't invent the divide between Australians who have options and those who don't, but it is exactly where that divide becomes impossible to ignore. You don't see it in policy documents or political debates. You see it in the price of a litre of milk, the miles driven for fresh food, and the quiet reality that for millions of people, the weekly shop isn't a choice at all. The checkout line just keeps moving. The real question is, who is it moving for?